The first thing that felt wrong was how clean the smoke looked against the morning air. In the pine flats, haze is normal. Heat and moisture soften everything until the forest looks like it was painted with water. This was different. It was a thin, steady column rising in a straight line from the darker country where the ground stayed wet and black, the kind of place that held water even when the sand ridges turned powder dry. I stood at the open window of my lookout cab and kept staring, not because I didn't know what smoke meant, but because I didn't like what it implied. In 1997, I was 29, seasonal, and assigned to a steel tower above Apalachicola National Forest, where high meant high enough to see over palmettos and longleaf pine crowns, not high enough to feel safe. Up there, you don't read the land by hills. You read it by color and texture. Pale patches are sand. Dark patches are swamp and muck. Straight lines are roads that look simple on a map and swallow people who treat them like pavement. I had been on duty since early spring, and by that point, I could tell you what normal looked like from any direction. Normal was a little smoke from someone's cooking fire near a legal site, a scattered haze after a distant prescribed burn, or nothing at all until lightning season got serious. Normal was also the sound of my own routine. Weather logged on the hour, bearings checked, windows wiped, binoculars wiped, the alidade set, the map board marked. Lunch eaten at the same time because the body likes predictability when the landscape doesn't offer it. That morning, before I saw the smoke, I already knew the day was going to fight me because I woke up at 5:30 a.m. with the air thick and sticky under the cab, the kind of humidity that makes your shirt cling before you've even stood up. I made coffee that tasted like the last pot, climbed the stairs with my keyring in my pocket, and stepped into the cab feeling the heat building, even though the sun wasn't fully over the tree line yet. When I went to use the tower phone, the line was dead. No tone, no faint hum, no life. Towers still had those old hard lines for a reason. They weren't elegant, but they were dependable. And when they weren't dependable, you treated that as its own problem. I picked up the receiver twice, listened longer the second time, then tried again as if patience could restore electricity. Nothing changed. I checked the junction plate where the line came in, lifted the cover, looked for an obvious break, and found nothing obvious because obvious breaks are rare. Whoever cuts a line with intent doesn't do it where you can see it from your porch. I set the receiver down and stared at it until I realized I was holding my breath. The job teaches you a plain rule. Treat smoke seriously, treat isolation seriously, and treat any change in your routine as if it's the first line of a report you haven't written yet. I went to the firefinder, took the bearing, and watched the column again through binoculars. It wasn't spreading, it wasn't mushrooming, it was rising like it had discipline. That alone made my stomach tighten because accidental smoke rarely has discipline. It wobbles, it smears, it drifts, it looks messy the way accidents are messy. This looked like a marker, a signal someone wanted me to see. I wrote the time and bearing in the logbook anyway, because you don't let nerves replace procedure. Then, I did what I didn't want to do. I looked down through the grated floor by the hatch to check my truck before I decided to drive out and report in person. My pickup was parked at the base where I'd left it, nose toward the access road, but it was sitting at a wrong angle, like somebody had nudged the front end sideways. It wasn't far, a few feet at most, just enough to make the position wrong to anyone who knew what it looked like when it was right. Most people would never notice. From 30 feet up, straight lines and angles jump out, and that small change looked as deliberate as a fingerprint. I went down the stairs fast, metal ringing under my boots, and stopped at the driver's door. The door was shut, but not seated. The latch hadn't clicked all the way. I opened it and leaned in, expecting to see something missing, or something added, or at least some sign of a prank. Nothing was obviously missing. Nothing looked torn up, but the smell hit me the moment I leaned into the cab. Cheap soda, bright and sugary, the kind that sticks to upholstery and plastic. I didn't drink soda in the tower. I didn't want sticky cans, ants, and the slow rot that comes with it. That smell didn't belong to me, which meant it belonged to someone else, and it was fresh enough that it still had bite. I checked under the seat and in the glove box with more anger than sense. My keyring was still in my pocket, solid. The ignition hadn't been tampered with. The steering column wasn't cracked. If anyone had wanted to steal the truck, they could have tried. If anyone had wanted to vandalize it, they could have done more than roll it a few feet. This wasn't a teenager with time to kill. This was someone making a point without leaving me an easy story to tell. I looked down at the sand and read it like a page. 2 clean tire tracks curved away from where the truck had been and returned to where it now sat crooked. The edges were crisp. The sand hadn't been churned like it is when a vehicle moves under its own power. It looked rolled, controlled, parking brake released and set again, and it looked done by someone who knew that a few feet is enough to unbalance a person's day. I walked a widening circle around the base searching for footprints, and that absence was worse than any clear tread. I found my own prints. I found old deer tracks, softened by time. I found raccoon prints near a damp spot. I did not find the boots that should have been there if someone had climbed into my truck and pushed it. That meant they'd managed their approach carefully, or they'd worked from a direction where the sand didn't hold detail, or they'd already been here long enough to know what the ground gave away. I went back up, locked the hatch behind me, and stared out at the smoke again, feeling the tower shrink around me. The forest looked normal, which is how it looks right before something changes. With the phone line dead, I didn't have a choice. If I wanted to do the job, I had to report the smoke in person. If I wanted to protect myself, I had to report the truck situation in person too, because a story told face-to-face carries more weight than one delivered through static or delay. I climbed down, got into the pickup, and turned the key slowly, listening like a paranoid man, because I had become one in the span of an hour. The engine started without complaint, which didn't comfort me. It told me whoever had touched my truck had left it ready for me to use, like they wanted me to leave the tower. I drove out on the sand road, keeping my speed low, eyes on the shoulders, half expecting someone to step into view and raise a hand. Nothing happened. The pine flats stayed still. The palmettos didn't move except with the light breeze. Behind me, that thin column continued to rise like a quiet announcement. The ranger station air conditioning hit my face like a slap, and the sudden cool made me realize how tense my jaw had been. The station was busy in a slow way, phones ringing behind the counter, a printer spitting out forms, a couple of visitors asking about trails and campsites like it was any other Saturday. On the bulletin board near the entrance were the missing teen posters I'd seen the day before. 2 faces, a boy and a girl from Tallahassee, both smiling in the staged way teenagers smile when an adult says, "Hold still." The paper was fresh enough that the corners still curled with newness. The text listed a last seen area near Forest Road 13, one of those numbered roads locals used and outsiders underestimated. I'd tried not to let those posters sit in my head yesterday. Standing there with a dead phone line and a moved truck, I couldn't keep them out. I told the front desk clerk about the smoke first, because smoke is what gets people moving. Then I told her about the phone line and the truck. The order mattered. If you lead with the strange part, people sometimes file you under nervous. If you lead with the work part, they have to take you seriously before you add the problem. Her expression tightened when I said the line was dead. She tested the tower number from the desk phone, listened, and shook her head at the silence. She called into the back office, and a few minutes later, Lenny arrived with the look he wore when something was both urgent and messy. He listened without interrupting, asked me to repeat the bearing, asked me to describe the smoke's location relative to the swamp margins, then asked about the truck. When I mentioned the soda smell and the lack of footprints, his eyes didn't widen. He didn't act entertained, he acted focused, which is what I needed. He told me an engine crew was being dispatched to check the smoke origin. He told me, in a tone that said he'd already made the call, that the county would be contacted to send a deputy to my tower because a dead phone line and vehicle tampering weren't forest business. Then he leaned closer and spoke in the plain language people use when they want you to understand without drama. He said I was going back to the tower because we didn't abandon a staffed lookout in that season, but I was going back with strict rules. Hatch locked at all times, no climbing down for anyone I didn't recognize, and if I saw anything around the base, I stayed up and made myself visible until help arrived. In other words, I was to become a lighthouse and nothing else. I nodded like a professional, but my throat was dry. Noah, a seasonal tech who'd been restocking towers and running errands, offered to follow me back part way. I didn't want company involved in my problem, but I also didn't want pride. We drove back in a small convoy, his white service truck behind my pickup, and the forest road felt narrower than it had that morning. The same trees, the same palmettos, the same flat distances, but now everything looked like it could hide something patient. When we reached the tower, the smoke was still visible, darker now, but still controlled. Noah helped carry up supplies, water, and batteries and canned food, and he stood in the cab for a moment, scanning the base through the grate like he was trying to see through sand and brush. He asked if I was sure the truck was moved. I told him I was sure. He didn't argue. He told me he'd be back later with more supplies if needed. Then he left, and I watched his dust trail fade until the road looked untouched. Once he was gone, the tower felt quieter in a way I hadn't noticed earlier in the season. I locked the hatch and forced myself to work. Hourly weather readings, a new entry in the logbook, a note about the smoke behavior. I washed my face at the small sink and watched the water run brown with sweat and dust. I tried the phone again out of stubbornness, still dead. At noon, the heat pressed against the cab windows like a hand. The smoke thickened slightly and leaned with the breeze, but it still didn't run like a normal fire. It held itself together like it was being fed. That phrase, being fed, kept repeating in my head, and I kept pushing it away because it sounded like superstition, but it was just observation. Fire needs fuel and oxygen. If it isn't spreading, something is controlling one of those variables. In a swamp margin, the easiest variable to control is ignition points, which means a person. Around early afternoon, when I reached for the logbook to write the next entry, a loose sheet snagged my finger from beneath the back cover. It was folded once and tucked under the flap like someone had hidden it quickly. I unfolded it and felt my mouth go dry. It wasn't a map or a note to me. It was a list, neat pencil handwriting, the kind people use when they are copying something and want it legible later. It had my routine written on it with uncomfortable accuracy. Wake time, when I usually stepped onto the catwalk, when I tended to eat, when I typically went down to check the base if I had to, even a note that said keys in pocket, like whoever wrote it had watched me and recorded my habits. At the bottom was a simple sketch of the hatch latch and the lock plate, with an arrow pointing to a weak spot where the metal met the frame. Beside the arrow were two words that made me feel as if the cab had been invaded again. Flex here. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. I just sat at the small table and stared at the paper until my eyes stung. The tower is a small room. You know every scratch on the counter, every stain, every screw that works loose in summer. Realizing someone had been inside it long enough to watch me and leave a diagram made the whole place feel contaminated. I folded the sheet and put it in my pocket because it was evidence, and because if I left it out and someone got in, it would be gone. Then I went to the windows and scanned the access road and the base and the surrounding palmettos until my eyes ached. Nothing moved. No dust, no glint, no obvious shape. The absence of movement felt staged, like a person holding still on purpose. At about 2 p.m., I heard a vehicle on the access road, heavier than the service trucks. It stopped out of sight behind the pines where the road curved. I waited for the sound of a door, a voice calling up, the normal behavior of someone arriving at a tower. I got silence. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs, steady, confident, the metal vibrating under each step in a way I could feel through the cab floor. I backed away from the hatch and checked the lock with my fingers, even though I already knew it was locked. My hands needed a task. I grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall because it was the only thing in the cab that felt like a tool instead of a comfort object. The steps stopped right below the hatch. Something hit the underside once, hard, like a test. Then a voice came up through the metal, muffled but clear, and it was the last kind of voice you want to hear when you're alone above flat woods. "Open it," the man said. I leaned down just enough to speak without putting my face near the seam. "Identify yourself," I called through the hatch. A short laugh answered me, dry, controlled. "You already know," he said. "I don't," I said. "You do," he replied, and the patience in his tone made my skin tighten. "Open it. We can do this easy." I didn't move. The hatch handle rattled. The lock held. He didn't slam it again right away. He waited, like he expected me to come around, like he understood that people talk themselves into bad decisions when they think there's time. The cheap soda smell drifted up through the seams a moment later, stronger now, like it was on his hands. My stomach turned at how specific that smell was. It was the same smell I'd found in my truck. That meant this was the person who'd been in it, the person who'd rolled it, the person who'd left the paper. He spoke again, still calm. "You found the sheet," he said, as if we were discussing a misplaced receipt. "That was for you." I went to the window and looked down through the glare. Palmettos shifted near the base, not from wind, but from movement. I caught a flash of denim and a dark shirt, then nothing. Whoever he was, he knew how to keep his face out of view. He wasn't trying to be seen. He was trying to be present. That is a different kind of threat. I told him, as steadily as I could, that a deputy was coming. I didn't say how I knew. I didn't say when. I just said it like a fact. He laughed again, and this time there was no humor in it. "Late," he said. "They're always late out here." The hatch jolted upward a fraction, and the frame flexed exactly where the sketch on the sheet had indicated. I threw my shoulder into it and felt metal groan. Something squealed, a bolt under strain. He pushed again, and the hatch lifted a hair more. This wasn't guessing. He was working the weak spot the way someone works a lock they've practiced on. My shoulder burned. Sweat ran down my back. I kept pressure on the hatch because if it opened, the cab became a trap with no back door. I tried not to picture what he might do once inside, not because I couldn't imagine it, but because imagination was a luxury I couldn't afford. I needed time. Time was the only thing between a locked hatch and an open one. Around 4:10 p.m., I saw a county truck come up the access road fast, a long tail of sand behind it. Relief hit so hard my knees felt loose. I moved to the window and leaned out, waving to catch the driver's attention. The deputy stepped out, one hand near his belt, and looked up at my cab. He didn't shout a greeting. He looked like a man arriving at a scene he didn't fully understand yet, which is how most bad scenes begin. I pointed toward the far side of the tower where the palmettos were thickest. The deputy nodded once and walked around the base, cautious but moving. From above, I couldn't see what he saw. I could only see his shoulders and head through gaps in the brush. Then he froze, and a figure stepped out behind him close enough to touch. I opened my mouth to yell, but sound doesn't travel the way you think it should when heat and distance and open space get involved. The deputy turned half a step. There was a sharp crack that sounded like a board snapping, and the deputy went down face down in the sand, sudden and complete. No struggle, no warning. The figure crouched beside him and took something from his belt with a practiced motion, like a man collecting tools, then looked up at me as if the glare and height didn't matter. He lifted one hand and gave a small, casual wave, like we were neighbors, and this had been a misunderstanding. Then he walked to my truck, opened the door, and reached under the seat. He pulled out a red plastic fuel can. I didn't keep a fuel can under my seat. Seeing it in his hands made my throat tighten because it told me he'd staged more than one part of this day. He set the can at the base of the stairs, poured a thin line of fuel through the palmettos in a curve around the tower legs, and lit it with an unhurried motion. Fire rolled low and fast through dry fronds, hungry, crawling rather than leaping, and smoke rose around the tower like a curtain. It didn't roar like a movie. It crackled and hissed, and that was worse because it sounded steady. He called up, voice easy. "Now you can open it, or you can cook." Heat rose through the grate under my boots. A thin layer of smoke slid into the cab and stung my eyes. I grabbed towels, soaked them at the sink, and stuffed them along the seams where the smoke wanted to enter. I aimed the extinguisher down through the smallest crack I could manage without losing the lock and blasted foam at the base, not to fight the whole fire, but to buy myself air and minutes. The chemical smell hit my nose and made me cough. I kept my shoulder near the hatch, listening for the sound of him climbing again, because I knew he wasn't lighting a fire for entertainment. He wanted pressure. He wanted me to make a decision under heat. That's what people like him do. They create a deadline and pretend it's nature when it's really them. The tower trembled as he climbed the stairs fast. He hit the hatch with his shoulder. The lock held. He shouted once, sharp, and the sound carried better than my earlier yell had. "Open it!" I backed away with the extinguisher raised, feeling ridiculous and helpless at the same time, and then the pressure changed again, not from him, but from the world. Engines, distant at first, then clearer, heavy vehicles pushing sand hard. The fire itself was a beacon now. Anyone working suppression on the earlier smoke, anyone monitoring the area, anyone passing within sight, would see a tower with smoke at its base and move toward it. I went to the window and saw the first engine truck break through the tree line with lights on even in daylight, followed by another, and behind them, a second county vehicle. The man at the hatch went still. I could hear him breathing through the metal, quick and irritated. He said, quieter now. That wasn't supposed to happen, as if he'd been writing the day and someone had changed a sentence. He let go of the hatch and ran down the stairs. The tower shook with his speed. I leaned out the window and saw him sprint to my truck, yank the door open, and try to start it. The engine turned over and died. He slammed the steering wheel once, hard, then jumped out and ran into the palmettos as firefighters spilled out of the engines and started knocking down the low flames around the tower legs. Another deputy ran straight to the body at the base and crouched, hand hovering like he didn't want to touch what he already understood. The scene became a swarm of controlled urgency, hoses pulled, water sprayed, boots in sand, short gestures, heads turning, people scanning for the man who'd just fled. They kept me in the cab until they had the fire ringed and the base cleared, and I obeyed because, for the first time all day, obeying was the safest option. When they finally told me it was safe to come down, my legs shook so badly I had to grip the railing with both hands. Halfway down, I had to stop and breathe because my knees wanted to fold. On the ground, they moved me into the shade of an engine truck and handed me water. Lenny arrived not long after, face gray and tight, and he didn't talk much. He just put a hand on my shoulder and held it there for a moment, like he needed to confirm I was solid. They found the man before dark. A deputy tracked him into a ditch line where he'd tried to hide under weeds and shallow water. He still smelled faintly of that soda, like it was part of him, and he still carried gear he didn't own. Later, when the immediate crisis had cooled into paperwork and statements, an investigator sat me down at the station and asked me to describe the day in order, starting with the smoke and ending with the fire at the base. I gave him the folded sheet from my pocket. When he unfolded it, his expression didn't change much, but his eyes did. He'd seen enough to know what it meant when a stranger writes your schedule in neat pencil. He asked where I'd found it. I told him under the logbook cover in the cab. He nodded and left the room for a minute. When he returned, he slid another item across the table in a clear bag. It was a tower key, not my spare, not a copy from a hardware store. The original, stamped and worn, the one that was supposed to stay on a ring at the district. They'd found it on the man when they arrested him. So when I say he'd been inside my cab before that day, I'm not guessing. He didn't get lucky and stumble onto my tower at the right time. He had access, he had patience, and he had a plan detailed enough to include my habits and the weak spot in the lock plate. He'd already stood in my cab at some earlier hour, breathing that bright soda breath over my counter, learning where I placed my logbook, where I stepped when I moved, what I touched without thinking. The smoke I saw that morning wasn't the first move of the day. It was the first move I noticed. Over the next week, they searched the roads and spurs around Forest Road 13 and the wet edges where the dark ground hides tracks. They found the missing teen's car pushed into young pines and covered with branches, like someone had tried to erase it. They found phones and a backpack buried in a trash pit. They found enough to confirm what the posters had been warning about, but not enough to bring the kids back. The county filed the charges they could file, and more followed when they searched the man's trailer and found property from other missing people stacked like trophies. People asked me afterward what the worst part was, expecting me to say the fire or the deputy or the moment the hatch flexed under pressure. The worst part was simpler than that. It was learning how quietly the tower had been prepared. It was realizing that in a place as wide and flat as Apalachicola, where you think you can see everything from 30 feet up, a patient person doesn't need to hide forever. He only needs to hide long enough to learn you, and then he can let you do the rest by following your own routine, right on schedule, until the day he decides to change it.